Have you ever experienced a moment where reality itself seemed to twist, where the familiar world around you suddenly became alien and terrifying? 2 years ago, I found myself in exactly that situation, an encounter so bizarre and chilling that it still haunts me to this day. Picture this: a dark, winding road, the feeling of something unseen watching, and the strange events that unfolded once I got home. It started as a regular evening, one like any other, but turned into something straight out of a nightmare, something that still makes me question my own sanity. The story begins on a cold night, one of those nights where the silence is thick, oppressive, and every small noise seems to echo endlessly. I had just finished work, exhausted but relieved to be heading home. I lived in a shared apartment with a friend, someone who was usually very independent and didn't always let me know if she'd be in or out. On this particular night, I assumed she was out, which didn't bother me. I was used to having the place to myself now and then. But as I walked back along that deserted, dimly lit road, an odd sensation started to take over me. It was subtle at first, like slight prickling at the back of my neck, a tingling that ran down my arms. I remember thinking it was just the cold, but deep down, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone on that road. Every instinct in me screamed that I was being watched, but each time I turned around, there was nothing but the dark, empty street. The kind of darkness that seems to swallow all light, where the only thing visible was the faint outline of trees swaying gently in the breeze. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if they were being matched by someone or something else. I picked up my pace, my heartbeat quickening, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But that tingling sensation only grew stronger, and a chill that had nothing to do with the cold crept up my spine. When I finally made it home, I felt a flood of relief wash over me. The familiar sight of the apartment building, the warm light spilling out from a hallway window, it all helped to push that irrational fear back into the recesses of my mind. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and everything was just as it should be. Quiet, empty, a safe haven away from the strangeness outside. I shrugged off my unease, telling myself I was just tired, and headed to my room to relax. I sat down at my desk, my computer glowing softly in the dim room, and began editing some photos I'd taken earlier. The repetitive work was calming, almost hypnotic, and for a while, I managed to forget about that eerie walk home. And then, she appeared, my roommate, standing in the doorway of my room, her silhouette framed by the dim light from the hallway. She greeted me in her usual, laid-back way, a smile on her face, and I felt an immediate sense of comfort. We started chatting, her voice familiar, her laughter as genuine as ever. We joked about some inside things, the kind of jokes that only close friends understand. She was just herself, exactly as I remembered. But even as we laughed, something felt wrong. There was a moment, a fleeting second, where her expression seemed off. A flicker of something I couldn't quite place. An emptiness in her eyes, a strange tilt to her smile. I tried to ignore it, laughing it off. But the unease from earlier came rushing back, stronger this time, impossible to dismiss. She lingered for a bit longer, then said she was going to her room. I nodded, watching her walk away, her footsteps echoing softly down the hall. 5 minutes passed, and I decided to continue the conversation. Maybe it was the lingering discomfort from that road, or maybe it was just wanting the company, but I got up and went to her room. I knocked, calling her name, but there was no answer. The room was empty, the bed made, everything untouched. Panic began to claw at my chest as I searched the entire apartment, living room, kitchen, even the bathroom. Nothing. It was as if she had never been there. The tingling returned, now a full-blown chill that gripped my entire body. The realization dawned on me slowly, horrifyingly. Whatever I had seen, whoever I had talked to, it wasn't her. The setting of that night is crucial to understanding the sheer terror I felt. Every detail of the place seemed to amplify the dread that grew inside me. The road I took to get home wasn't just any road. It was a narrow, winding path, flanked by thick woods on either side, their shadows stretching out like skeletal fingers, clawing at the edges of the dimly lit street. No streetlights illuminated the way, just the faint silvery glow of the moon breaking through the clouds. Every step I took felt heavier, my breathing louder in the stifling quiet of the night. I could hear the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes, each sound echoing into the void, swallowed up by the darkness that seemed to grow thicker with every passing second. The air was still, almost unnaturally so. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The deeper I got into the road, the more intense the sense of isolation became. The wind that usually rustled the leaves was absent, and even the occasional nocturnal sounds of animals seemed to have been silenced. It was as though something had driven all life away from that stretch of road, leaving me utterly alone, or perhaps not alone at all. A chill ran down my spine, the kind that feels like a warning, like the primal part of your brain trying to tell you that danger is near. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the oppressive silence. Reaching the apartment building should have brought relief, and for a moment it did. The old building stood in stark contrast to the eerie quiet outside, with its warm lights spilling from the windows, offering a sense of safety. But even then, as I walked up the narrow stairs, the old wood creaking under my weight, the unease didn't leave me. The hallways were dim, illuminated only by the faint yellow glow of an overhead bulb, which flickered now and then, casting unsettling, shifting shadows. I passed by my roommate's closed door. It was silent, dark, as I had expected since she often went out without telling me. But something about the darkness behind that door seemed wrong, as if it was deeper than it should have been, a void that stared back at me. Finally, I reached my room, and the familiar sight of my computer waiting on the desk gave me a momentary reprieve. I turned it on, the screen's soft glow immediately filling the space, casting long shadows across the walls. I sat down, took a deep breath, and tried to immerse myself in editing the photos. The hum of the computer, the clicking of the mouse, all of it felt mundane, comforting even, after the strange journey home. But the unease, that prickling sensation that had started on the road, never fully left me. It was there, a constant presence in the back of my mind, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. And then she appeared, my roommate, standing in the doorway, as if she had always been there. The suddenness of it nearly made me jump out of my chair. I hadn't heard her enter, hadn't heard her footsteps approaching. One moment, the doorway had been empty, and the next, she was there, her face partially obscured by the shadows of the hallway. She stepped into the room, her features coming into view, a smile playing on her lips. It should have been reassuring, but there was something off about her appearance, something subtle, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Her eyes seemed a little too wide, her movements slightly too stiff, like a puppet on strings. As she spoke, I tried to shake off my unease. She sounded like herself, joked like herself, mentioning things only she and I knew about, our inside jokes, the kind that no one else would understand. But even as we laughed, her voice echoing softly in the room, there was an undercurrent of wrongness that I couldn't ignore. The way her smile lingered just a second too long, the way her eyes never quite seemed to blink. It was like staring at a mirror that reflected everything perfectly, yet still left you with the unsettling feeling that something was missing, something vital, something human. When she left the room, the air seemed to change. The warmth that had been there vanished, replaced by an intense, almost suffocating cold. I sat there, staring at the empty doorway, the shadows seeming to stretch further now that she was gone. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that I was just tired, but deep down, the fear was growing. I realized then that the darkness outside hadn't stayed outside. It had followed me in, seeped through the door, and was now lurking somewhere in the apartment, wearing the face of someone I trusted. It began with the smallest, most innocent of signs, those subtle hints that something wasn't right, though at first I refused to believe it. As I sat at my desk, the soft hum of the computer filling the silence of my room, the air around me seemed to grow thicker, heavier, like an invisible weight pressing down on my shoulders. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, a coldness that seemed to seep out of nowhere, chilling me to the bone. I glanced over at the window, thinking perhaps I had left it open, but it was tightly shut and the curtains were still. The air felt wrong, stagnant, almost suffocating. Then the noises began, faint at first, barely noticeable, like distant whispers just beyond the edge of perception. I paused, straining my ears, convinced that I had imagined it. But there it was again, a soft murmur coming from the hallway, as if someone was standing just out of sight, talking in a low, hushed tone. My first instinct was to call out, but my voice caught in my throat, a primal fear rooting me to the spot. The sound seemed to move, growing slightly louder, then fading, drifting in and out, like it was circling me. My heart began to pound, and I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was just the creaks and groans of an old building settling in the night. But it wasn't just the sounds. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking, stretching unnaturally long, moving almost of their own accord, as if they were alive. I could feel a presence in the room, something I couldn't see, but could sense, a feeling of being watched, of eyes lingering on me from every darkened corner. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there, just the same empty space, but I knew I wasn't alone. The tingling sensation returned, now crawling across my skin, making every hair stand on end. It felt like 1,000 tiny eyes were on me, unseen but undeniably present. And then there was the door to my room, slightly ajar, just enough for me to see a sliver of the hallway beyond. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a movement, a flicker of something passing by. I turned quickly, my eyes locking on the doorway, but there was nothing, just the darkness beyond. I stared at it, my breath held, waiting, watching. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, and just as I was about to look away, I saw it again. A shadow, something moving, swift and silent, vanishing as soon as it had appeared. My stomach twisted with dread, the cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I called out my roommate's name, my voice shaky, barely more than a whisper. There was no response, only the echo of my words bouncing back at me, mocking me with the emptiness that filled the apartment. The unease turned into full-blown fear, my instincts screaming at me that something was very, very wrong. I got up from my chair, my legs feeling weak beneath me, and slowly made my way to the door, my eyes fixed on the hallway beyond. The silence was deafening, pressing in on my ears, amplifying every tiny creak of the floor under my feet. As I stepped into the hallway, the cold seemed to intensify, wrapping around me like a freezing fog. The shadows here were deeper, almost as if they were tangible, pulsating with a dark energy that seemed to watch me. I called her name again, louder this time, but still, there was no answer. Just that oppressive silence, and then a soft noise, a gentle creak, like a door being pushed open, coming from the direction of her room. My heart leaped into my throat, the sound reverberating through the stillness. I hesitated, every part of me wanting to turn back, to lock myself in my room and pretend none of this was happening. But I couldn't. Something compelled me to move forward, to find out what was happening. The door to her room was slightly open, a thin line of darkness visible through the gap. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pushed it open. The door swung inward with a soft groan, revealing nothing but darkness. Her room was empty, just as I had left it earlier. The bed was untouched, everything in its place. But the air in there was even colder, the sense of something lurking just out of sight even stronger. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath me, and the door behind me suddenly slammed shut with a deafening bang. I jumped, my breath catching in my chest, my pulse racing as I spun around. The door was closed, the handle motionless, but I knew that something was there, something unseen, playing with me, testing me. The whispers returned, louder now, circling me, coming from every direction and none at once. My vision blurred with fear, my body frozen as the realization hit me. Whatever had followed me home wasn't human, and it wasn't done with me yet. The air was heavy with a sense of impending doom, and I stood frozen in the middle of that cold, empty room, my thoughts spiraling into a chaos of disbelief and terror. There was something here, something I couldn't see but could feel watching me, and felt wrong, malicious. A part of me screamed to run, to get out of the apartment and never look back, but there was another part, one that demanded answers. Was this some twisted prank? Was my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there truly something sinister lurking in the dark corners of my home? The urge to flee battled with a morbid curiosity that kept me rooted to the spot. My instincts told me to escape, but there was a gnawing sense of being drawn deeper into the mystery, a pull I couldn't resist. I could hear my own breath, shallow and fast, echoing in the silence. I wanted to ignore everything, to pretend none of this was happening, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep without finding out. Every nerve in my body screamed against it, but I turned back to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the hallway. The hallway stretched out before me, darker than before, as though the shadows had thickened, swallowing up the light. My heart pounded in my chest, a drumbeat of fear, as I forced myself to move forward. I passed by my room, glancing briefly at the comforting glow of my computer screen, but something pulled my gaze towards the far end of the hall, towards a living room. The air seemed colder the closer I got, and the sense of being watched was almost unbearable. The shadows seemed to twist and move, unnatural shapes writhing in the corners of my vision. I reached the living room, and the sight that greeted me made my stomach drop. The door to the balcony was slightly ajar, though I was certain I had locked it before. It swayed gently, creaking, as if someone, or something, had just passed through. My hands trembled as I approached it, each step feeling like I was getting closer to some terrible truth I wasn't ready to face. The curtains moved faintly in the cold breeze, and I hesitated, feeling that whatever lay beyond that door, it was something I could never unsee. It was as if the very air was whispering, urging me to turn back, to leave while I still could. But I couldn't stop now. I pushed the door open, stepping out onto the balcony, my eyes scanning the darkness. The street below was deserted, the road barely visible under the dim moonlight, but there, just out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, shifting against the railing. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its form was vague, almost like smoke, twisting in a shape that defied understanding. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if aware of my presence, and I felt my blood run cold. The figure turned towards me, and though I couldn't see its face, I knew it was looking directly at me. The air seemed to vibrate, a deep, unnatural hum filling my ears, drowning out every rational thought. My body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, trapped in the gaze of this formless entity. There was a sense of familiarity about it, as though it was mimicking something, someone, trying to look human, but failing. It felt wrong on a fundamental level, an abomination of everything natural. And then, it began to move towards me, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to echo in the silence. My legs felt like lead, the fear paralyzing me as I watched, unable to tear my gaze away. It reached the threshold of the balcony door, and in that moment, pure, unfiltered terror surged through me. Every instinct screamed that if I let it inside, if I allowed it to cross that boundary, something terrible would happen, something irreversible. I had to make a decision. I could feel the cold radiating from it, a darkness that seemed to pull at the edges of my consciousness, whispering for me to submit, to let it in. But somewhere, deep inside, a spark of self-preservation flared. With a burst of desperate energy, I reached out and slammed the door shut, the force of it jolting me back into action. I locked it, my hands shaking violently, and stumbled backwards, gasping for air, the sound of my own ragged breathing filling the silence. The shadow remained on the other side, unmoving, almost as if it was waiting. I could see its outline through the glass, a dark, shifting mass that seemed to blend with the night. I backed away, my heart pounding, and turned, running down the hallway, back to the perceived safety of my room. I slammed the door behind me, locking it as if that flimsy piece of wood could somehow keep out whatever horror was lurking beyond. I collapsed onto the floor, my back pressed against the door, my chest heaving with each panicked breath. I had faced the unknown, stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. And now, I was left with a choice I wasn't sure I was brave enough to make. Stay and face whatever this was, or leave and abandon everything I knew. The weight of that decision pressed down on me, the fear and confusion intertwining until I couldn't tell one from the other. Somewhere in the silence, I heard it again, that whisper, faint and echoing through the walls, a voice that sounded almost familiar, almost human. It called my name, softly, insistently, as if inviting me to come back, to face it once more. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whatever had followed me home wasn't going to leave. It was waiting, watching, and sooner or later, I would have to decide whether to confront it or become its next victim. The time had come. I had avoided it long enough, but the sense of dread that had crept into every corner of my apartment was now impossible to ignore. The whispers had grown louder, no longer faint echoes in the background but clear, taunting voices that seemed to know me. They whispered my name, repeated my thoughts, and laughed in tones that mimicked my roommate's voice. The air was colder than ever, an icy chill that seemed to seep into my bones, and the shadows had taken on an unnatural quality, moving in ways that defied logic. I knew that whatever it was here with me, inside my home. I could feel its presence growing stronger, feeding off my fear, lurking just beyond my vision, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The decision I had made earlier, to confront it, to end this nightmare once and for all, now seemed like a terrible mistake. But there was no turning back. If I was going to have any chance of reclaiming my life, I had to face it head-on. I stood in the middle of a living room, the silence pressing in on me, my breath misting in the cold air. The apartment felt different, almost unrecognizable, as though it had transformed into something else entirely, somewhere dark, alien, and malevolent. The flickering light above me cast strange, twisted shadows on the walls, and for a moment, it almost looked like they were reaching out, stretching towards me. I clenched my fists, my heart pounding in my chest, and called out into the darkness. "Who's there?" My voice echoed back at me, small and terrified. There was no response, only the deep, suffocating silence that had become a constant presence. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Show yourself," I demanded, though my voice trembled. The air seemed to thicken around me, and for a moment, I thought I could hear something, a movement, a whisper that seemed to come from the far corner of the room. Slowly, I turned my head, my eyes widening as I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, standing in the far corner, just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall and thin, almost impossibly so, its shape shifting as if made of smoke. The longer I looked at it, the more it seemed to change, its form rippling, pulsating with a dark energy that made my stomach turn. It had no face, just an empty void where eyes should have been, and yet I knew it was watching me. The fear that had been simmering inside me now turned into full-blown terror. I could feel my body trembling, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But I stood my ground, unable to look away, unable to move. The figure began to shift, stepping closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring my fear. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, clearer, words that seemed to be coming from inside my own head, urging me to let go, to give in, to stop resisting. It was as if the darkness itself had come alive, wrapping around me, pulling me towards it. The shadows moved, swirling around my feet, crawling up my legs, cold and suffocating, and I could feel my strength slipping away. My vision blurred, my head pounding as the whispers grew deafening, overlapping until they were nothing but a cacophony of noise, drowning out my thoughts. The figure was closer now, its faceless void mere inches away from me, and I could feel its presence like a heavy weight pressing down, on my chest. Desperation clawed at me, and I knew I had to do something, anything, to break free. With all the strength I could muster, I forced myself to move, to fight against the pull of the darkness. I reached out, grabbing the closest thing I could find, an old lamp on the side table, and swung it wildly towards a figure. The lamp shattered, the sound echoing through the room, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The figure recoiled, the shadows retreating, and I stumbled backward, gasping for air. The whispers fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the figure seemed to dissolve, fading back into the darkness from which it had emerged. I stood there, panting, my heart racing, as the room returned to an eerie stillness. The cold remained, the shadows still danced at the edges of my vision, but the presence had receded, at least for now. I knew this wasn't over. Whatever it wasn't gone. It was still here, lurking, waiting for the next moment of weakness. I could feel it, watching me from the corners, its dark energy still lingering, a reminder that this nightmare was far from finished. I had confronted it, had pushed it back, but I knew deep down that it would return, stronger, hungrier. And the next time, I might not be so lucky. The air was thick, with a sense of impending doom. I had thought that facing the entity would bring clarity, or at least some form of closure, but the truth was far more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. As I stood there, trembling in the aftermath of the confrontation, I began to notice something that made my blood run cold. The whispers hadn't stopped. They had only changed. Now they were coming from within the walls, echoing around me in a twisted symphony, as if the entire apartment had become a vessel for whatever darkness I had invited in. I tried to steady my breath, but the oppressive atmosphere seemed to be closing in on me, the shadows growing denser, almost as if they were alive. They pulsed and writhed across the walls, and I realized with a sickening certainty that the entity wasn't gone. It had simply retreated, becoming one with the shadows themselves. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that my breath fogged up in front of me. I could see my reflection in the window, and behind me, the dark shapes seemed to shift and contort, taking on vaguely human forms. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, overlapping until they formed a single word, a name. My name, over and over again, spoken in a multitude of voices, some of them familiar, some twisted and inhuman. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The entity knew me. It knew everything about me. It had been watching, listening, learning, and now it was using that knowledge against me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my pulse thundering in my ears as the whispers became more insistent, more commanding. It was no longer just a presence. It was a force, something that wanted me, wanted to take me. In a desperate attempt to escape, I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the furniture, and made my way down the hallway to my room. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it, though I knew it was a futile gesture. The whispers continued, muffled now, but still there, reverberating through the very walls. My eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could help me, but everything felt alien. The once familiar surroundings were now bathed in a cold, unnatural light, every shadow a potential threat, every corner hiding something sinister. And then, amidst the chaos, I saw it, a photograph on my desk, one that I had taken just days ago. It was of my roommate and me, smiling, happy, oblivious to the darkness that would soon descend upon us. But something was wrong with the picture. My hand shook as I picked it up, my eyes widening in horror. The figure standing next to me wasn't my roommate. The face was wrong, blurred, distorted, with eyes that were nothing but dark, empty voids. It was the entity, mimicking her, taking her place. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the truth. This thing had been with me for far longer than I had thought, slowly infiltrating my life, replacing the people I knew with its twisted imitations. Panic surged through me, and I dropped the photograph, backing away until I hit the wall. The whispers grew louder again, more insistent, and I could feel the shadows creeping closer, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I knew then that there was no escaping it. The entity had become a part of my life, entwined itself with my reality, and now it was claiming me. The lights flickered, and I watched in horror as the shadows coalesced in the center of the room, forming into a shape, a tall, gaunt figure, its faceless head turning towards me. Its presence was overwhelming, a suffocating darkness that seemed to suck the very air from the room. I could feel my strength draining, my will to fight slipping away as it stepped closer, each movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring my fear. The whispers became a roar, filling my head, drowning out all other thoughts. The entity raised a hand, and I could see the shadows twisting around its fingers, stretching towards me, ready to pull me into the darkness. And then, in a moment of clarity, I understood. The entity wasn't just trying to scare me. It wanted me to submit, to surrender willingly. It fed on fear, on despair, on the darkness within me. If I gave in, if I let it take me, it would win. I had to fight back, not with force, but with my will, with my refusal to be consumed. I closed my eyes, blocking out the sight of the looming figure, the swirling shadows, the oppressive darkness. I focused on the memories that were real. My roommate's laughter, the warmth of the sunlight streaming through the windows, the sense of peace I had once felt in this place. Slowly, the whispers began to fade, the darkness receding as I held onto those memories, those moments of light. I opened my eyes, and the entity was no longer there. The shadows had returned to their natural state, the cold dissipating, leaving me standing alone in the room. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted, but I knew it wasn't over. The entity had retreated, but it was still there, waiting, watching, ready to strike again at the first sign of weakness. I sank to the floor, exhausted, my body trembling from the ordeal. I had faced the darkness and pushed it back, but the terror remained, the knowledge that it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity. And as I sat there, the room silent once more, I knew that this was only the beginning. The entity had shown me its power, its ability to twist reality, to invade my life, and I knew that the fight was far from over. The darkness had taken root, and I would have to be vigilant, always, or risk losing myself to it completely. The nightmare wasn't over, but the confrontation had ended, for now. I had managed to repel the entity, yet I could still feel its presence, lingering like a shadow at the edge of my consciousness. The apartment, once my sanctuary, had become an alien landscape, each familiar object now carrying a sense of dread. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light seemed to hint at the lurking darkness, a reminder that this horror could return at any moment. The oppressive cold had lifted, but in its place was an emptiness, a silence that felt more threatening than comforting. As the hours crawled on, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I tried to rest on my bed, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the sensation of something standing at the edge of the room, just beyond my sight, watching. I would snap my eyes open, half expecting to see that faceless entity standing there, its dark form blending into the shadows. But there was nothing, only the dim, shifting light of my desk lamp. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what it wanted, to drain me, to keep me in a constant state of fear, vulnerable, ready to break. Eventually, exhaustion won over, and I drifted into a restless sleep, the whispers haunting my dreams. They were calling me, urging me to step into the dark, to join them in that cold void beyond reality. I saw images of the entity, its twisted form reaching out for me, the apartment walls closing in, the shadows stretching towards me like tendrils. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the sense of dread only growing stronger. I knew I couldn't stay here, not any longer. The apartment was no longer my home. It was its domain now. Morning came, and with the first light of dawn, I began to pack my things. Each movement felt mechanical, my mind numb with exhaustion and fear. I knew I had to leave, but deep down, I also knew that running wouldn't solve anything. The entity wasn't bound by walls. It wasn't a mere haunting of a place. It had found me, chosen me, and wherever I went, it would follow. Still, I couldn't stay here, surrounded by the memories of that night, the whispers echoing in my mind. I needed to get out, to find somewhere that didn't hold the lingering darkness of what had transpired. As I packed the last of my belongings, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A fleeting movement, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. My breath caught in my throat, my body tensing as I turned to face it. There, on the wall, was a dark stain, barely noticeable at first, but growing larger, darker, as if the very shadows had bled into the surface. It pulsated slightly, almost alive, a reminder that I could never truly escape it. My hands trembled as I backed away, my heart pounding in my ears. I had to leave now, before it was too late. I left the apartment without looking back, the door slamming shut behind me. Each step down the hallway felt like a step away from sanity, as though the building itself were holding on to me, urging me to stay. The air was heavy, the silence deafening, but I forced myself forward, refusing to let the fear control me. As I reached the street, the sunlight felt foreign, the brightness almost painful after the suffocating darkness I had left behind. I breathed deeply, trying to rid myself of the cold that had settled in my bones, but it lingered, a reminder that the entity was still out there, waiting. The days that followed were a blur. I found a new place, smaller, nondescript, somewhere I thought I could start over. But even here, the shadows seemed different. At night, I would hear faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing, the same dark voices that had haunted my old home. I tried to ignore them, tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the remnants of a traumatic experience. But deep down, I knew the truth. The entity had marked me, and no matter where I went, it would be there, watching, waiting. One night, as I sat alone in the new apartment, I heard it again, the familiar creak of a door opening slowly, a sound that shouldn't have been possible in this new place. My heart sank, the fear flooding back in an instant. I turned, and there it was, a shadow in the hallway, tall, impossibly thin, its head tilted as if observing me. The whispers returned, louder, more insistent, and I realized that this was my life now, a constant struggle against the darkness that had taken root in my soul. The entity was patient. It knew I would weaken eventually, that my fear would open the door for it to return fully. The realization was like a knife to the chest. This wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from. This was my reality, a fight against an invisible force that fed on my fear, that wanted to consume me. I could run, I could hide, but it would always find me. I was left with only one choice: to fight every single day, to refuse to give in to the darkness. As I stared into the hallway, the shadow fading into nothingness, I knew that the battle had only just begun. And though I was terrified, though every part of me wanted to collapse under the weight of that fear, I stood my ground. The entity might have found me, might have claimed some part of me, but it hadn't taken everything. Not yet. And as long as I had even the smallest sliver of willpower left, I would resist. I would face the darkness, the whispers, the cold void that threatened to swallow me, and I would fight, because that was all I had left. The days blurred into weeks, and though I had moved, the sense of dread never truly left me. The new apartment, with its clean walls and unfamiliar layout, was supposed to be a fresh start. But every night, as the shadows lengthened and the world outside grew silent, the memories of that encounter returned, as vivid as the night it happened. The whispers, though faint, still echoed in the silence, a constant reminder that I was never truly alone. I could hear them when I closed my eyes, soft, almost affectionate, calling my name as if beckoning me to return to that cold embrace. During the day, I tried to distract myself, burying myself in work, forcing myself to go out, to be among people. I would walk crowded streets, the noise and the chaos a welcome distraction from the silence that awaited me at home. But even in the bustling crowd, there were moments, fleeting, terrifying moments, when I felt it. A presence, watching me from a distance, just out of sight. I would turn, expecting to see that twisted, dark form, but there was nothing, only the indifferent faces of strangers passing by. Still, the feeling lingered, a chill that seeped into my bones, reminding me that it was never far away. Nighttime was the worst. No matter how tired I was, no matter how much I tried to exhaust myself, sleep never came easily. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence, waiting for the whispers to start. They always did, soft at first, like a breeze moving through the room, but growing louder, more insistent, until they filled my mind, drowning out all other thoughts. Sometimes, I would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, shadows shifting, a figure standing in the doorway, watching. I knew it wasn't real. At least, that's what I tried to tell myself. But it felt real, more real than the daylight, more real than anything else. One particular night, I awoke suddenly, my heart pounding, the room filled with a darkness deeper than anything I had ever seen. The air was heavy, suffocating, and I could feel it. The entity, there with me, its presence pressing down on me, freezing me in place. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the whispers filled my ears, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. It felt as though the darkness was alive, pulsating, wrapping around me, trying to pull me under. My eyes darted to the corner of the room, and there it was, standing there, its faceless head tilted, watching. Panic surged through me, my body fighting against the paralysis, and with every ounce of strength, I forced myself to move. I reached for the lamp beside my bed, the light flickering on, and in that instant, the figure was gone. The darkness receded, the whispers fell silent, and I was left alone, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. I sat there, the light casting long shadows across the room, and I knew this was my life now. A constant battle, a war against something I couldn't see, couldn't escape. The entity was patient. It had all the time in the world, and it knew that eventually I would tire. The next morning, I looked at myself in the mirror, and I barely recognized the person staring back at me. My eyes were hollow, my skin pale, the weight of the sleepless nights and constant fear etched into my face. I knew I couldn't keep going like this, but what choice did I have? I couldn't run, couldn't hide. There was nowhere it wouldn't follow me. The only thing I could do was face it, fight it, even if it meant living in fear for the rest of my life. I began to research, diving into books, old archives, anything that could help me understand what I was dealing with. The stories I found were chilling, tales of entities that attached themselves to people, feeding off their fear, slowly driving them mad. They were stories of people who had tried to fight, who had resisted, only to eventually disappear, lost to the darkness that had claimed them. But there were also stories of survival, of people who had faced the darkness and won, though the cost was always high. I clung to those stories, hoping that somewhere in the pages, I would find the key to my own salvation. I started to notice patterns. The entity thrived on my fear, on my isolation. The more I withdrew, the stronger it seemed to become. I knew I had to change something, had to break the cycle, or it would consume me. I forced myself to reach out, to reconnect with friends, to let people back into my life. It wasn't easy. Every time I heard a whisper, every time I saw a shadow move, I wanted to retreat, to shut myself away. But I knew that was exactly what it wanted. The entity was still there, lurking, waiting, but I refused to give in. I began to speak to it, to tell it that it wasn't welcome, that it had no power over me. At first, the whispers grew louder, angry, but over time, they began to fade. The shadows still moved, still watched, but their presence felt weaker, less substantial. I knew I hadn't defeated it, not completely, but I had taken back some control, and that was enough for now. As I sit here writing this, I can feel it. The cold, the darkness, just at the edge of my vision. It's waiting, watching, but I am no longer afraid. I have faced it, looked into the void, and though it still lingers, I know that I am stronger than it. The battle isn't over, and maybe it never will be, but But as long as I have the will to fight, as long as I refuse to let the fear consume me, I know I can keep it at bay. To anyone out there who might be facing something similar, know this. The darkness is powerful, but it feeds on your fear, on your isolation. Don't give it what it wants. Fight it, even when it feels impossible. Find the light, hold on to it, and never let go. The entity may always be there, but so will you. And as long as you're still standing, the darkness hasn't won.